The young subject of our video today's name was Edward Morrison Warusam, but his friends and family called him by his nickname, Baidham. There was a lot to Baidham that defined him, that's for sure. At only 16 years old, Baidham already showed that he was going to grow up to be a very promising young man. He grew up on the island of Saibai, just 4 kilometers south of Papua New Guinea. He lived in a small rural village where kids get to be kids. They run and play in the wilderness and spend their days riding on the island's fiberglass canoes called banana boats. Baidham was a natural athlete. A big boy from an early age, he towered over most of his classmates. His handsome features certainly caught the eye of more than one teenage girl. But unlike most tall and muscular boys that tended to be strong but slow, Baidham was unusually quick on his feet, perfect for soccer. But instead of settling for just one sport, he played both soccer and rugby, and he sure played them well. You'd think that a handsome boy with such natural athletic abilities would have let the gifts of genetics go to his head. But no, Baidham was sweet and kind. He got along with absolutely everyone. If he wasn't teaching the youngsters how to fish, he was helping one of the elderly members of the community to carry their loads to the market for them. He took special delight in teaching his 8 brothers and sisters how to handle a ball on the field, and there was no bully or boy who would dare take advantage of the Warusam sisters, not with Baidham there to protect them. He was the kind of son any parent would be proud of. In June of 2024, Baidham and another boy, only identified as his 13-year-old friend, were out in a banana boat. There was never any reason given as to why the teenagers were out there that night, and we can only assume that they were on their way back from Papua New Guinea, using the boat to sail back to his island. Sailing over to the other island for shopping isn't all that uncommon. Whatever the reason, the boys were late coming in, and it was already dark out. Using the lights from the village, they navigated their way through the rain. To say that the conditions weren't ideal is an understatement. The storm that was rolling in hadn't quite reached its peak, but the constant rain was causing water to pool at the bottom of their raft, and the waves were slowly picking up in size. To make matters worse, the boat's engine wasn't exactly in tip-top shape. It had been sputtering and coughing plumes of smoke for days, and the extra effort to get through the rough waters was just too much for the motor to handle. Just 500 meters off the shore, the engine suddenly gave out. The boys actually laughed at their bad luck at first. Luckily, both were very strong swimmers, and the shoreline was already in sight. It wasn't like this was a full-blown storm yet, and they'd swum through worse before. But without warning, the boat was rocked by a large wave, capsizing it in one swift motion. The boys went flying into the surf head first. When they came up, their laughter had disappeared from their lips. They would have to leave the vessel behind. There was no way that they would be able to swim to shore, dragging an upside-down boat with them. It was going to sink in seconds anyway. Their closest point to dry land was right beside a well-known crocodile breeding spot. Had it been daylight, the boys would have recognized it immediately. Even foolhardy kids weren't willing to risk swimming in that specific area of the island. The place was teeming with crocs big and small, and the females were especially aggressive if they perceived a danger to their young. But this just happened to be the fastest and straightest path to get out of their predicament. The younger boy put his head down and struck out in a freestyle. Baidham, however, settled for a breaststroke and allowed him to keep his head above water so that he could keep an eye on his friend, who was swimming just feet ahead of him. Otherwise, he'd have been way ahead of the younger boy. But Baidham promised him that he'd keep an eye out in case the lad couldn't handle the waves. Baidham was keeping guard ahead, squinting in the rain, never taking his eyes off the dark head of his friend, who was barely visible in the rain downpour. An 11-foot crocodile was a little farther out from shore than it would usually go because the storm had disoriented it. But even in the darkness, it sensed the boys as soon as they were thrown off the boat. And with them heading straight toward it already, there was no way that it was going to let such a good opportunity slip by. It focused on Baidham simply because he was slower. To the crocodile, it looked like a weaker animal, lagging behind the pack. but not even a young man as fit and strong as Baidham could have stood a chance against the predator racing towards him under the dark water. It was smooth and quick. It simply sailed out of the water, slammed its heavy body down on Baidham's back, and as they were driven down into the deep, it lashed its tail around and wrapped itself securely around the boy. Baidham barely had time to register that there was 600 pounds worth of reptile on his back before the crushing squeeze from the animal's body completely enveloped him. The two went spinning down, deeper and deeper. The beast's death roll was in full effect until they finally reached the sandy bottom of the ocean, and there they lay, Baidham's struggles becoming ever weaker by the second. The other boy never even knew what was transpiring behind him. He kept swimming until he reached the beach, and by then, Baidham was long dead, and the croc was swimming with its lucky meal to the very inlet where the boy was standing. Confused that there was no one behind him, the boy wondered if this was a silly prank to scare him. But Baidham was not a prankster, and this situation was already far from being funny. The lad waited only 5 minutes before he ran for help. There was no way he'd be underwater for that long. He'd have had to come up for air. This was serious. Barefoot, he ran through the brush and the rain and reached the village in minutes. He banged on the door of the first house he could reach. The residents knew him by sight, and they knew Baidham too. The call to the authorities was placed immediately, and before the hour was out, the whole village, police, and Baidham's siblings and parents were all out there in the deluge, searching every inch of the shoreline and riding out into the storm with floodlights, but they found nothing. It was no use in the dark and the rain. The next morning, the storm still hadn't let up, but at least it was light. It didn't take long for them to locate Baidham's body. He was found tucked into a nook of the inlet where the boys were heading toward. The bite marks on his shoulder and his partially eaten leg was enough to confirm that he hadn't drowned as everyone had thought, but the evidence was undeniable. Baidham had drowned, but not because of the rough waters. He'd been drowned intentionally, and then the culprit had begun to eat him too. Now they needed to find the beast. The island as a whole agreed that the animal needed to be euthanized. Everyone was devastated. Every home, every business, and every soul on Saibai went into a deep stupor. Sadness almost can't describe the cloud of grief that descended on the people. They'd lost one of their own. A boy who they celebrated when he was born, who took his first steps in front of the auntie next door. The lad who carried a girl home when she scraped her knee, and the teenager who was going to become some lucky girl's husband one day. A day after his body was found, one of the searchers, still out looking for crocs that fit the size that was estimated from the bite marks, noticed a crocodile that not only fit the description, but that was also displaying some unusual defensive behavior. Just feet from where Baidham's body was found, it was pacing up and down the shoreline. It was murderously angry that the body was gone and was seeking out the thief. With its head up high, the aggressive crocodile stormed into the water towards the rescue boat, where it was shot. And sure enough, when a necropsy was performed, Baidham's remains were found in its digestive tract. A bit of rotten luck and a bad storm was all it took to rob a promising young man of his bright future and bringing him to his terrifying final affliction. 20 miles southeast of Brisbane, Australia, lie North and South Stradbroke Islands. At just over 100 square miles, the North is the second largest sand island in the world. It is popular for fishing, both by boat and straight from the beaches. Although there is accommodation in the 4 towns on the North Island, being so close to the mainland, many visitors just spend the day exploring the islands. There are regular water taxis to transport people to and from Stradbroke. Back in 1974, 31-year-old Peter Hodgson and his 30-year-old neighbor Adrian Trevelou decided to spend a couple of days fishing there. It was September 1st, a Sunday evening, when the two men headed down to the water to board their boat. It was small, just under 3.5 meters long. It was basic, but it was all they needed for a short fishing trip. It had a cabin for them to sleep in, and they loaded it up with their fishing gear. They began to relax as they motored out into the open water. They headed towards South Stradbroke Island, and as evening set in, it was an area they knew well, and they had fished it many times before. As darkness descended upon them, they let out the anchor and called it a night. The gentle rocking of the boat soon lulled them to sleep. They woke early the next morning, ready for a full day of fishing. At 7 a.m., Adrian crouched at the bow, whilst Peter manned the engine and gently edged the boat forwards over the anchor. When the chain began to slacken, Adrian started to pull it upwards, but it was caught on something and wouldn't budge. He grappled with the rope. He could see the chain disappearing into the water directly below them, but it was stuck fast. With the chain growing ever tighter as the boat drifted over the top of it and across to the other side, the bow of the boat suddenly ducked down into the water. Adrian was nearly thrown overboard. Instead, he clung on as the bow continued to plunge into the sea. It took only a few frantic seconds before the boat had taken on too much water. It swamped the boat, and the two friends rushed to grab their life jackets. They managed to pull them on just as the boat submerged below the waves. It was a terrifying ordeal, and the two of them splashed about in the water, staying close to each other as they watched the boat sink. Rather than disappear completely, the upturned boat remained there, its hull pointing skywards. It was an eerie sight, and one which filled them with dread. Looking all around them, all they could see was the enormous expanse of open water. They were now at the mercy of the sea and all that lived in it. The two of them had no means to contact the mainland. They hadn't sent out a distress call. Instead, they held on to each other and tried to grab hold of the hull. It was too slippery to climb onto, and it was barely sticking out of the water. It wouldn't be much longer before it was lost to the depths forever. The waves were growing. Both men ducked under them as they arched and crashed over the top of them. Each time they were doused by the waves. They came up to the surface gasping for air. The routine was relentless. Trying to keep their heads above water was a constant battle. It felt like they were drowning. They were desperate for help, but none came. As the day wore on, their hope for rescue dwindled, but at least they had each other. They were now drifting with the currents. Trying to swim against them was pointless. It only wore them out, and they weren't making any headway. They could feel the power of them as they were dragged along. They didn't know how far they were from shore anymore, and time seemed to go on forever. But they were drifting towards a deadly enemy. As nighttime approached, so too did the predators of the deep. The sun dropped below the horizon, and their entire world was draped in an apron of darkness. Only the moonlit sky provided just enough light for them to see one another and a few yards around them. In one heart-stopping moment, their worst nightmare came true. Everyone's worst nightmare. Peter spotted a dorsal fin slicing through the surface of the sea not far away. He could see the white bubbles as it broke through the water. The fin was directed at the two men. The shark below was coming for them. Peter shouted at Adrian to kick the shark when it came at them. Striking it on the nose or in the gills was their best form of defense. They were the shark's weak spots, its sensitive areas. Huddled together, they knew the shark was upon them. They couldn't see it now as it had dived below the waves, but it must have been close. Seconds later, and Adrian let out a low groan. The shark had seized him around the waist. He was ripped from Peter's arms and dragged under the water. Instantly, Peter kicked at the shark. He could now see the terrifying dark shadow of the giant fish just below the surface. Adrian thrashed around, trying to pull himself up for air. Peter kicked again. He scraped himself on its sandpaper-like skin. He landed a few hits on the shark, and it let Adrian go. Peter pulled him back up to his side, and he coughed, spluttered, and gargled. He was severely wounded. Blood poured from the gaping wound on his side. It was only a matter of time now. Peter was worried that the bloody shadow that they were now floating in would draw the shark back to them. Thoughts of a feeding frenzy entered his mind, but he spoke calmly to his friend. He held on to him tightly, keeping his head above the water, promising him that they would get out of this. But 10 minutes after the attack, Adrian succumbed to his injuries, and his head slumped forwards. There was nothing Peter could do, no way to bring him back. He was now dead weight in the water, weighing down Peter, who was struggling to keep himself afloat as well as his friend. In an agonizing decision, he decided to let him go. Watching Adrian slowly drift away from him was heartbreaking, and now the sense of aloneness really hit home. But instead of giving up, Peter tried to keep fighting. He was so vulnerable in the water, not only to predators, but also from exposure to the elements. Somehow he had managed to make it to the end of the day with Adrian by his side, and now he was determined to make it through the night. He knew that he was floating bait for any hungry sharks nearby. He continuously scanned the water, with only the silvery moonlight reflecting off its surface to see. He looked wide-eyed for the telltale sign of a dorsal fin or the white water of a small bow wave coming for him. He would have only seconds to react, but at least he could be as ready as possible. But thankfully, it never came. Instead, after the terrifying hours of the night, dawn broke, and with it the distant lights of surfers' paradise. The sky was lit in red and golden yellow. Peter couldn't believe he had survived to the next day. Everything felt better in the daylight, but he could feel himself fading. The energy was being sapped from him, and he didn't have long before he too would succumb to the ocean. As the sun lifted up above the horizon, fisherman Barry Power was heading out for his morning catch. He fired up the engine of his boat and set out from the shore. It was something he did every day, but as luck would have it, his path would cross with Peter's. By some miracle, the line he took was heading straight for the 31-year-old. He couldn't be seen at first with just his head on the surface of the sea, but as the boat drew nearer, Peter suddenly let out a yell. He had heard the distant buzz of a boat engine and had tried to lift himself up out of the water as much as possible to get a better look. He weakly kicked towards the shore, but he was still 12 miles from dry land and safety. As Barry's boat came into focus, Peter waved his arms in the air. He was completely drained. He had been in the water for almost 24 hours. Miraculously, Barry spotted the bright orange life jacket and Peter's fatigued attempt at attracting his attention. He steered the boat over to him and immediately hauled him aboard before rushing him to shore. Only then could Peter let out a sigh of relief. He had made it, but he had left his friend behind, something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Peter was transported to a Southport hospital, where he was treated for severe shock, immersion, and exposure, but lived to tell his tale. He had narrowly escaped the same fate as his friend, a terrifying, final affliction. In the late 1500s, Dutch explorer Willem Barents set out on 3 expeditions to the frozen north. His aim was to find a northeast polar passage connecting Europe to China. He left his native home of Holland and traveled northwards over Scandinavia and then east to the Barents Sea, named after him. It would open a valuable trade route, saving time shipping cargo between the 2 destinations. But his expeditions were fraught with challenges and obstacles, not least of all the inhospitable environment of the Arctic. Twice, Willem had to turn their boat back around and head for home when they reached dead ends. But on the 3rd expedition, they managed to carve their way further along the proposed route until disaster struck. On September 11, 1596, Willem and his crew were trapped by pack ice surrounding the boat. They couldn't go forwards, and they couldn't go back. They were stuck, frozen on the ice sheets drifting around the sea. They would have to endure a winter in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. They decided to build a cabin on the ice, a place where they could stay during the winter. Conditions were brutal in the Arctic. For 4 months over the winter, the sun doesn't rise above the horizon. The constant dusk-like light makes it difficult to distinguish night from day. Equally, the cold is almost unbearable. It averages -30 degrees Celsius, -22 Fahrenheit, a bone-chilling cold that is inescapable. As their supplies dwindled, they were forced to venture further to find driftwood to keep fires going. They salvaged what they could from the boat and trapped and ate Arctic foxes to preserve their food supply. If being trapped in an ice sheet in the ocean isn't scary enough, they were plagued by polar bears. They were very curious. Some climbed onto their boat. Some scratched at their hut, trying to find a way in. The polar bears were a constant fear for everyone. Their first sighting of one of those impressive animals made an impression on the crew. They tried to capture it so they could take it back to Holland to show people. They lassoed the bear, but it became apparent that handling a full-grown polar bear on a confined ship was a death wish. In the end, they killed it and planned to take the pelt back home. The crew found it difficult to kill the polar bears. Shooting them often only maimed the animals and made them more dangerous. It seemed like pain fueled the animals' rage. But despite them being hard to kill, they managed to take some of them down and used their fat to power their lanterns, providing light in an otherwise dark land. The meat they were able to cut from the bears was enough to last the entire winter, and it was a lot better tasting than the Arctic foxes. However, on one occasion they ate the polar bear's liver, which almost killed the entire crew. A well-known fact now, but unknown to the men at the time, was that polar bear liver has such a high level of vitamin A that eating it can be fatal. Symptoms of polar bear liver poisoning depend on the amount of liver consumed, but usually include weakness, vomiting, diarrhea, drowsiness, headaches, hair loss, bone pain, peeling skin, and blurred vision. If someone eats too much polar bear liver, symptoms include full-body skin loss, hemorrhaging, coma, and death. Scurvy was also a constant battle for the men. Their bodies were unwashed, and the stench inside the hut enticed the polar bears even more. A small group left the hut and went to search for driftwood. Nothing grew in the frozen land. There were no trees or shrubs, no vegetation that they could burn to keep their fire going, to keep them warm and to cook on. Instead, they had to scavenge from their boat and from what the sea brought them. They hiked for miles, carrying with them a sled that they could load up. It was hard work trudging through the ice and snow. They were ill-prepared for the conditions. They hadn't anticipated having to leave their ship. They had no snowshoes and no warm winter clothing. As they walked closer to the open sea, the ice became thinner. It became more and more broken up. Sometimes the men had to step from one floating island of ice to the next. It was dangerous. One bad move, one slip, and they would fall into the water. Hypothermia would set in within seconds. They wouldn't stand a chance. But there were worse dangers out there than hypothermia. Polar bears continued to be on the prowl. The men knew the dangers they faced. They saw how aggressive the bears could be and how powerful they were. Their initial awe of the animals had long since worn off. Now they were terrified by their existence. As they stepped onto a floating island of ice, something caught their eyes. In the distance, something moved, white against white. It was a polar bear, and it was interested in them. As it walked, the men could see its characteristic lumbering gait, the way its head swung gently from side to side as it ambled towards them. The men raised their guns, but they knew from experience that it was very difficult to kill a polar bear. Unless it was a direct shot into its skull, the bullet would only injure it, causing it to become more aggressive. At that time, the polar bears were curious of people. They hadn't yet learned to fear them, and as a predator that is constantly on the lookout for an opportunistic meal, it was dangerous. They had lived as the apex predators of the Arctic for centuries. They knew no different. The bear continued to close the gap between them. It didn't run, it didn't charge, but it made steady progress. When it was just 20 feet away, it stopped and raised its head skywards, sniffing the air. The men hoped it would turn back. They hoped it would see the group of them as a threat and turn away. But without warning, the polar bear went from a complete standstill to a full-on charge in a millisecond, reaching speeds of up to 25 miles per hour. Polar bears can easily outrun a human. It closed the gap between them in seconds. The men leapt across to another floating island of ice. When the bear reached the edge of the ice, it slipped into the water and disappeared from sight. The men huddled together, looking over the edge into the icy water. Where had the bear gone? Maybe it had given up. Maybe it had swum underneath them and continued swimming. But just then, to their horror, the polar bear popped up beside the ice, its fur slicked down with the water, its enormous head peering over the top of the iceberg. Then, with one huge paw, it swiped at the men. It caught one of them with its 3.5-inch, 9-centimeter-long claws and dragged him kicking and screaming into the water. The other men fired their guns, but in the commotion and the chaos, they missed. They then watched as the bear dragged their companion out of the water and onto the nearby ice. They could see the man was still alive. He was struggling to breathe, coughing and spluttering as the bear bit down on his skull. They heard the crack of bone, the crunch from the bear's powerful jaws. Then their friend fell silent. The men were trapped on the island of ice. They endured the torture of having to watch their friend being devoured by the bear, blood spilling onto the pristine white snow. The bear lifted its head. Its muzzle had turned red as it turned to look at the rest of the crew. Were they going to be next? They were in a conundrum. Should they stay still, waiting for the bear to finish its meal and leave? Or should they make a break for it whilst the bear was distracted? Every time they tried to move, the bear stopped eating and looked up. It may be more aggressive now that it was protecting its kill. No one knew what to do. Very slowly, the men inched away. They never took their eyes off the bear as they crept back towards the relative safety of their hut and fellow crewmates. When they made it back to the hut, shaken and traumatized, they crawled inside and delivered the devastating news to the rest of the crew. That night, they had to endure the terrifying sounds of a polar bear scratching at the roof of the hut, trying to break through, trying to catch its next meal. They were terrified the door would burst down at any moment and they'd be the next to get eaten alive. How long could they endure this torture? It would be 10 months before the men could depart the frozen Arctic. By the following June, the sea ice had melted enough for them to begin their journey home. They had spent almost a year in the grueling Arctic conditions. Their ship was irreparable, but they managed to sail 2 smaller boats southwards back towards Holland. They made it to Kola Bay, just north of Scandinavia, hungry and weak, still in the same clothes they had been in 10 months earlier. They boarded a Dutch ship which sailed them down to Holland, but Willem didn't make it. He died on the journey. His final expedition had come to a sad end. Of the 17 crew to set out on the venture, only 12 made it home to their families, many of them having witnessed one of the worst polar bear attacks of all time, a polar bear dragging their friend into the ocean and onto a sheet of ice, eating him alive as he slowly succumbed to his final affliction. The serene Catalina Channel is a symphony of water and light located in Los Angeles. The ocean here is alive with an abundance of sea life, from playful dolphins to graceful seagulls and pelicans. Since the earliest known time, the channel has been used as a means to connect Santa Catalina Island and the Southern California mainland. Today, the 20-mile-long channel is famous for hosting free diving and swimming competitions, thanks to its clear and shark-free waters. However, in the early 20th century, ruthless predators lurked deep beneath these balmy waters, occasionally rising to the sun-kissed surface to cause havoc in the Catalina Channel. Such was the case with a father and son, whose encounter was one of the most terrifying Los Angeles has ever seen. On Friday, July 27, 1935, Dr. Alfred Wilkes had just finished his shift at Georgia Street Receiving Hospital in Los Angeles, where he worked. His son, 23-year-old Barney Wilkes, left San Pedro for Avalon to meet his father. In the evening, the duo had planned to cross from the Southern California mainland to Santa Catalina Island by boat using the Catalina Channel, also known as the San Pedro Channel. As they unhooked the ropes that tethered their boat securely to the dock, the duo commenced their journey as the sun dipped below the horizon. The boat, now free, bobbed and swayed gently as the ropes were cast away. 58-year-old Dr. Alfred skillfully started the engine, which hacked and sputtered in response. It didn't start. He then hauled the pull start rope, this time around with more effort. The engine hummed and purred to life as the boat sliced through the water. Dr. Alfred carefully guided the boat away from the dock into the Catalina Channel as the harbor and the lights of the shore receded into the distance. The air was thick with the salty scent of the sea, with the sound of the waves and that of the roaring outboard engine as their only company. Their boat was the only sign of life in the entire vastness. To them, it was a humbling experience to be this small in the grand scheme of life and at the mercy of the elements of nature. The choking and spurting of their boat engine as it desperately gulped the last remaining drops of gasoline snapped them out of their reverie. The steady hum of the motor had now changed as the boat began drifting aimlessly. They had forgotten to check the gasoline level while at the dock. The duo exchanged worried glances as their faces twisted in a grimace of frustration. Dr. Alfred tried starting the engine using the pull start rope, but his efforts were fruitless. They had only covered a third of their 20 miles journey. Their hearts sank at the thought of being stranded at night in the middle of the sea. Suddenly, a loud bang interrupted them. There was an explosion at the stern of their boat. A spark had ignited the engine, worsening the situation by multiples. The odds were against them. The explosion had punctured the boat's hull, and water began seeping in. They desperately grabbed anything their hands could reach to stop it. However, no matter how fast their hands moved to scoop the water out, it was gushing in 10 times quicker. They could see the waterline creeping up the sides as the boat started tilting. They tried to patch the holes, but they were large, and there was multiple to cover. The boat was becoming more unstable and sinking with every passing second. "We have to jump into the water," said Dr. Alfred, before he stood on the gunwale and jumped off the boat. Barney followed suit as well, lunging himself forward into the water. They watched as their boat took its last tilt before capsizing. Exhausted from removing the water from the boat, the duo agreed swimming to land wasn't an option, and thus decided to cling on the overturned hull, hoping that help would arrive soon. They were now at the mercy of the water current and the chilling night cold. Throughout the night, they held onto the overturned boat, using it as a makeshift life raft as they struggled to keep their heads above water. Drenched and tired, the howling cold winds had them shivering and their teeth chattered as the cold water soaked their bodies to the bones. Soon enough, fatigue began to kick in, and they struggled to stay afloat as their bodies were battered by the dancing waves. They looked at each other. The expressions on their faces showed a mixture of fear and determination. "You have to hold on, son. Help will be here soon," Dr. Alfred encouraged Barney. Their muscles were burning with exhaustion, but they were determined to make it through this test of survival. As the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Dr. Alfred's strength was depreciating. His fingers and arms were numb from holding onto the boat all night long. He was visibly in distress. Barney jumped into action and saved him just before he fell below the water after losing his grasp on the boat. He stood on top of the capsized boat and began pulling him up. However, just before his father was completely out of the water, a shark that had been lurking beneath with its beady eyes set on a possible meal cut the waves and attacked, biting Dr. Alfred's ankle. Barney managed to pull him out before the shark could drag him into the depths. He then scanned the sea and saw nothing but the dancing waves. The shark was nowhere to be seen. Unfortunately, the blood from his father's ankle had stained the water, attracting other sharks. Within no time, there were more than a dozen sharks circling them. As they drew closer, he instinctively tried to pull his fatigued father to the peak of the hull, but Dr. Alfred slipped and fell back into the water. Before Barney could reach him, one of the sharks leaped out of the water with its mouth wide open. Barney's eyes widened in terror as the shark lunged toward him, slamming into the side of the boat. He kicked and punched it with its teeth gnashing inches from his face. He could hear the wood splintering under the force of the shark's attack as it thrashed around. Luckily, the shark abandoned its attack and swam back into the depths, giving Barney a chance to save his drowning father. While laying down on top of the boat and reaching for his father's hand, another shark sunk its serrated teeth into Barney's ankle. He kicked hard, hitting its snout, which prompted it to let go of his leg. He then diverted his attention back to his father and this time successfully pulled him back on top of the hull. As his father's body was pulled out of the water, Barney was horrified to see that one of the sharks had gotten to him and parted with chunks of flesh from his abdomen. Suddenly, the honking of a purse seiner ship named Excellent brought the deadly attack to a halt. The sharks vanished beneath the waves as quickly as they had appeared. The crew members of the ship quickly lowered their ladders and rescued the duo from the jaws of death around them. They listened as Barney recounted their harrowing experience before rushing him to the Santa Catalina Island Hospital, where his punctured ankle was stitched. His father was unresponsive and had to be rushed to the intensive care unit. Sadly, the doctors pronounced him dead. An autopsy revealed that there was water in his lungs, confirming drowning as the primary cause of his death. He had already breathed his last before the ocean's deadliest predators launched their attack. Being an old case, the exact species of shark that attacked the two men that day is still unknown. Let us know in the comments what kind of shark you think is responsible for the attack that night, resulting in Dr. Alfred's terrifying final affliction. Sailing the oceans on a luxury yacht sounds like the perfect way to spend a day or two. But what do you do when the yacht gets caught in a severe storm miles from the nearest land? Hopefully, the situation doesn't turn out like it did for Captain John Lippoth and his crewmates. It was a clear, sunny day in October 1982, and Deborah Kiley was excited to complete a job that she had been given. She had been tasked with transporting a luxury 18-meter yacht from Maine to its new billionaire owner in Florida. Deborah was a confident sailor and had even competed in the 70,000-kilometer Whitbread round-the-world race, now called the Ocean Race. She even became the first American woman to complete the event in 1981. The 24-year-old woman was joined on her journey aboard the yacht by a group of her friends. There was the captain of the ship, John Lippoth, his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, and friends Brad Kavanaugh and Mark Adams. The day was perfect for sailing, with clear, bright blue skies. Deborah couldn't have asked for better conditions to set out on the luxury ship. The journey was to take 6 days long and be over 2,000 kilometers, so the group of friends would have plenty of time to enjoy the yacht and simply relax as they sailed to their destination. But things didn't exactly go to plan. 2 days into the journey, the skies above the group of 5 began to darken, and, in the distance, a brewing storm crept ever closer. By nightfall on the second day, the yacht was caught in the middle of a severe and violent tropical storm. The storm was so bad that winds up to 110 kilometers per hour and waves 10 meters high battered the yacht. Deborah had been sleeping in the cabin when the panicked voices of her friends awoke her. Rushing to the deck, the young woman was horrified to see that their captain, John Lippoth, was lying drunk at the wheel of the ship. Immediately, all 5 of the friends began screaming in fear. With the amount of water that was rushing over the yacht, the group knew that the worst possible thing was happening. They were sinking. With no other option, the group of 5 jumped off of the sinking yacht and into the rolling waves below. However, just before Meg was able to escape, she lost her footing and fell into a sharp part of the ship, cutting her legs severely. But with no time to do anything about it, the woman jumped into the water with her friends. Thankfully, Mark had been able to grab an inflatable dinghy which the terrified group of young men and women clung to as they watched the 18-foot yacht sink beneath the ocean, never to be seen again. Acting quickly, all 5 crew members clambered onto the dinghy, but as Mark pulled himself into the boat, he felt something hard nudge his leg. Once in the safety of the dinghy, the group peered into the dark water below them, where Deborah was just about able to make out the shape of something that looked like a torpedo. Thinking that it was a fish at first, the young woman was horrified to realize what the creature actually was as it swam closer. Swimming just below the surface of the waves were hundreds of sharks. The animals had been drawn to the group as they had smelt the blood seeping from Meg's wound. Hungry and ready for a hunt, the sharks rammed against the dinghy from all directions. All Deborah and her friends could do was hold on to the small life raft and pray that they would make it through the night. As the hours waned on, the storm gradually faded and daylight broke through the darkness of the night. At first, the group of 5 friends were relieved. They believed that they would be able to get to safety in the daylight, as surely someone would be able to spot them in the dinghy. But as the hours passed by and all that Deborah and her friends could see was the never-ending expanse of blue sky and ocean, their hope quickly began to disappear. By the 3rd day of drifting aimlessly in the ocean, the group of 5 friends had no hope at all. Meg's wound had become seriously infected, leaving the young woman dealing with a severe case of blood poisoning. If she wasn't able to get help, and quickly, it was likely that she wouldn't last much longer. As well as that, everyone on the dinghy was starving and unbearably thirsty. And with so much water all around them, it wasn't long before John and Mark decided to brave the salty taste of the ocean and to gulp down as much as they could. The problem with this, though, is that the salt content in seawater is much higher than what can be processed by a human body. And because water is needed to process the salt in the body, it actually leaves the person more dehydrated than before they had a drink. After a few hours, both Mark and John had begun suffering from the side effects of the salt water. The severe dehydration that they were enduring led them to begin to hallucinate. John Lipoth was the first to succumb to his hallucinations. He claimed that he could see land far off in the distance. Unable to persuade him otherwise, the rest of the crew could only watch as their captain dove into the water and began swimming towards the land that only he could see. As the group of 4 watched John swim away, they all jumped as a scream tore through the air. The blood-curdling scream only lasted for 1 moment before silence descended once again. Deborah and the rest of the crew knew what had happened. The sharks, which had been lurking underneath them for days on end, had finally gotten their first meal. Horrified, Deborah, Meg, and Brad sat frozen in the dinghy, unsure of what to do next. But Mark was none the wiser. Lost in his own hallucinations, Mark stood up and told the rest of his friends that he needed to run to the store to buy some beer and cigarettes. Then, ignoring the panicked pleading of his friends, he stepped off of the dinghy and into the water. However, this time when the sharks attacked, Deborah and the other 2 crewmates were able to see a lot more. Because of how close Mark was to the life raft, the rest of the crew were able to feel as the great whites rammed into the boat underneath as they tore apart and bit into Mark. Every bump and rock of the little dinghy had Deborah crying. She could only imagine what was happening beneath her, how the sharks were sinking their 2.5-inch razor-sharp teeth into Mark's body and ripping him apart. The young woman never imagined that something so horrific would happen to her, and she was terrified that she would end up in the same situation as Mark and John. The hours passed by with Deborah, Brad, and Meg lying in the dinghy, full of a faded mixture of urine, pus, and blood from Meg's wound. It was clear that things weren't looking good for the young woman. Her wound had become so infected that her leg had actually started to turn black. Eventually, as the 4th day rolled around, Deborah Kiley and Brad Kavanaugh awoke to find that Meg had passed away from her injury sometime during the night. Now, when people are stuck in extremely difficult situations, it can lead them to think about doing things that would never usually cross their minds. and with how hungry and thirsty he was, Brad couldn't help but contemplate eating Meg's body. It had been 4 days since he had had anything to eat and drink, and the young man knew that he couldn't continue to go on without eating her, or he would surely die too. However, Deborah was able to get him to come to his senses. She told Brad that eating Meg was out of the question. Not only was she their friend, but her infection was so bad that it was likely that it would do more harm than good to cannibalize her. But the two remaining friends also knew that Meg's body couldn't remain in the dinghy with them. Her wound was oozing pus from the infection, and if even a small amount of it got into Brad or Deborah's blood, then they would also become severely ill. With no other option, the two remaining survivors stripped Meg's body of her clothes and jewelry. They wanted to give the young woman's family something to remember her by. Then, after reciting the Lord's Prayer, Deborah and Brad gently pushed the body of their friend overboard. Not wanting to listen to the sharks devouring another one of their friends, Deborah and Brad went straight to sleep. By the 5th day at sea, Deborah and Brad had given up all hope of being rescued. Seeing all of the blood and other bodily fluids in the boat, the pair of survivors decided to try and clean up the dinghy. As Brad was trying to empty the raft, though, a rogue wave suddenly had him tumbling over the side of the boat and into the shark-infested waters below. Panicking, as neither he nor Deborah wanted the sharks to attack again, Brad tried his hardest to clamber back into the dinghy, but with how exhausted and weak he was, Brad was unable to lift himself up. Resigned to his fate, the young man clung onto the side of the raft, waiting for the moment when he would feel the painful bite of one of the sharks. Right at that moment, though, off in the distance, both Deborah and Brad spotted what looked to be a cargo ship. After confirming with each other that it was real and not a hallucination, Brad became reinvigorated. Seeing how close he was to being rescued, the young man managed to haul himself back onto the life raft. Once safely back in the dinghy, Deborah and Brad began yelling as loud as they could for help. After the cargo ship was close enough and had spotted the pair of survivors, they lifted both Deborah and Brad out of the water and onto the safety of the ship. Safely on board, the two survivors learned that they were 140 kilometers south of Cape Lookout. This meant that they drifted almost 150 kilometers off of their original course. But the ordeal wasn't over for the two of them. Those fateful 5 days at sea changed Deborah and Brad's life forever. For years after the incident, Deborah couldn't close her eyes without hearing the screams of her friends as they were eaten by sharks. She went on to write about her ordeal in 2 separate books, whilst also becoming a motivational speaker about surviving against all odds. Sadly, in 2012, at the age of 54, by causes unknown to the public, Deborah also met her final affliction. The following is one of the deadliest shark attacks in recorded history. The terrifying ordeal of this event is the true story behind the 2010 movie, The Reef, which remains one of the most intense and hair-raising shark attack films ever created by Hollywood. It was 1983, and 27-year-old Ray Boundy was living his best life out in the scenic tropical city of Townsville, Australia. Captain of a long trawler boat, he was recognized as a capable and experienced sailor, despite his young age. On July 22nd, he and his crew were making preparations for a shrimp fishing journey on the North Australian coast. He was accompanied by his second captain, 23-year-old Dennis Murphy, and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Linda Horton. They were aware of a particular region of water between Townsville and the Great Barrier Reef, famed for being a great fishing ground. Ray intended on staying a few more weeks just to capitalize on this area that had calm water, slower winds, and plenty of fish. The first 2 days of this endeavor were a joy, filled with relaxation, laughter, and good catch. But it was on the 3rd day that things took a turn for the worse. There was an unexpected high wind in the area. The crew had to make a choice, whether to head back to town, which was still several miles away, or to weather out the storm and wait for it to pass. But many hours had gone by, and the winds showed no signs of slowing down. It was midnight now, and the dark was setting in, compounding their problems. The weather worsened, and the waves started to crash against the boat with great force. It was now that the crew realized their trawler boat had serious internal flooding, and tried as hard as they could to keep it afloat. It was suddenly that Dennis noticed a giant wave hurtling toward them, and with little time for judgment, he jumped off the boat, which capsized after being hit. Ray and Linda, who were too late in noticing the wave, now found themselves trapped under the boat with a small pocket of air to breathe. The two quickly planned on getting out of this predicament by swimming far under to the bottom of the capsized boat and then coming back up from the other side. After resurfacing, the two noticed Dennis not far away and quickly regrouped. The trio started assessing what options they now had, stuck in the middle of the water, with a capsized and drowning boat, which was their only solid ground to stand on between miles of water in every direction. In this distress and confusion, a few hours passed. They were now breathless, tired, and cold. It was Monday, and Ray calculated where they were based on his coordinates. He realized they were at least 95 kilometers from Townsville and 45 kilometers from the closest coral islands. It was obvious that swimming all the way to either side was extremely difficult, but the group quickly realized they didn't have much of a choice. The sinking ship would soon disappear, and they had a few minutes to salvage some things from it before it went down. And so they gathered some items from the shipwreck, tied them together with ropes, and got a surfboard to act as some form of support in the turbulent water. It was a flimsy, makeshift solution, but it was all they had for the 45-kilometer journey to the islands. With no access to drinking water, bearing the scorching heat of daytime, and the grueling physical exertion of constant swimming made them breathless, thirsty, and drained of energy. But they knew the only way was either forward or eventually down into the water. These were prime fishing waters, and this meant that humans weren't the only ones looking to catch them. Sharks were a regular visitor to this area, and encounters with curious sharks was a dangerous, real possibility. An entire day off swimming had passed, and the crew were still at least 30 kilometers from land. Night was now setting in, and the dark quickly engulfed their sight. Then there was some commotion in the water. It wasn't any of the crew. The trio froze and tried not to make sudden movements. They saw a fin in the water, not far from where they were. It was a shark. They didn't know what else to do but to remain still, afloat, and quiet, in hopes that it swims away after a casual encounter. Dennis and Linda were visibly frightened. Their heartbeats were racing, and they couldn't control the fear and adrenaline rush. Ray tried to comfort them by whispering how rare shark attacks were, and that the curious sharks usually leave humans alone if left unprovoked. At this point, their makeshift life raft had now broken up, and each one of them was now in possession of a small piece that was keeping them afloat. Tiger sharks are only the second largest after great whites, and their size and jaw strength make them one of the most formidable marine predators. They can weigh up to 2,000 pounds, and both their lower and upper jaws have inward-facing teeth, allowing for them to grip and chew off anything or anyone unlucky enough to get in their grip. All of a sudden, Ray felt the touch of the enormous shark beneath him. There was little Ray could do. It was soon after that the shark circled back and bit him on his knee. Ray kicked it with as much force as he could muster, which made the shark relent and swim off. But the shark now had tasted blood, and they knew it was coming back. Panic had now set in, and no one was quiet anymore. All three were now screaming and splashing in the water, desperate for respite from the shark. They were trying frantically to scare off or outrun it, but to no avail. Every time they heard a splash back in the distance, they'd turn their heads, anticipating the shark's comeback. It was hard to spot it underwater. The pitch dark favored the shark and put the helpless crew at a stark disadvantage. It broke the water once again, then just as swiftly disappeared back under. Suddenly, Dennis let out a loud scream in agony. "It's got my leg! The bastard's got my leg!" Ray shouted from afar, imploring Dennis to try kicking it again, but it didn't work as well as it did last time. But now the shark had come to feast, and was unwilling to relent or let go of Dennis. Ray and Linda looked on in horror, helpless as Dennis got pulled under and above the water several times before letting go. He was incapacitated and in extreme pain. The water surrounding him resembled a pool of blood, and it was obvious that he was losing blood fast. As Ray and Linda swam up to him, it became clear that Dennis was missing an entire leg, and the profuse bleeding would soon render him unconscious. They tried to use a piece of cloth as a tourniquet in an attempt to stop the blood loss, but it wasn't long before the shark reappeared, not sparing them even a few minutes of respite. Dennis now realized that he could not be saved and that it was best to let himself become the shark's bait, to buy Linda and Ray enough time to escape. Dennis shouted at them to leave without him, and so they started swimming in the opposite direction. There was little time to process the emotion or the gravity of Dennis's sacrifice. All they knew in the moment was that they had to get to safety or his sacrifice would be in vain. They turn around and look at Dennis one last time before he's finally pulled under, never to be seen again. Linda, unable to hold back her emotions, let out cries of helplessness. Ray offered her momentary comfort, but it was clear they had no option but to sustain a steady pace toward the island. 2 hours had passed, and their speed warranted optimism of their survival, but it was short-lived. The shark appeared once again and began circling Ray and Linda in a cynical fashion. The shark took a plunge deep into the water as they were both frozen in fear. All of a sudden, it broke the water surface and this time went straight for Linda, biting into her arms and torso. With a firm grip on her body, the shark shook its head violently from side to side in an attempt to chew off a bite of her before diving back into the water once more. All that was heard from Linda was a light squeal. Her death was swift but painful and in a state of terror. Everything fell dead silent for a moment. Ray was terrified into cold inaction, still trying to fathom the gravity of losing his girlfriend. He then turned around and swam as fast as he could toward the stone reef. His fight and flight response kicked in, and he finally got close to it after a day of swimming. It was a few hundred meters away from shore that the shark resurfaced once again. But Ray noticed an approaching big wave and was able to catch it, using its speed and height to create distance from the shark. He was finally thrown onto the reef, exhausted and severely traumatized. He finally let his emotions go and started to process what had just happened. 27-year-old Ray was discovered the next day at 10 a.m. by an Australian Air Force rescue chopper that had been searching for the crew since they went missing after the storm. Ray went on to become captain of more boats and lived his life as a fisherman. He was never able to fully recuperate from the intense psychological trauma from the nightmare incident, and for long suffered anxiety and PTSD after those grueling 36 hours in the summer of 1983, the day he lost his girlfriend and best friend, narrowly escaping his own terrifying final affliction.